For the past 33 years, I've gotten nothing but coal in my stockings every Christmas, but unlike all you other full-grown men and women out there, I'm at least man enough to admit that I probably deserved it, because I've been quite the bad boy. I'm a very good bad boy! I mean, sure, I did do some good deeds here and there, but you don't really score too many points at Santa when those good deeds were legally required for community service hours, much less so when the evil in the initial crime far outweighs the good. But I mean, how was I supposed to know that it was wrong to unplug my stepdad's hemodialysis machine? I mean, I was trying to charge my GameCom. Apparently it was particularly heinous and highly illegal everywhere on the planet though, which is why it's my duty to inform you, the viewer, that third-degree manslaughter is never a victimless crime. But I mean, it was kind of self-defense if you really think about it. But anyway, now that I got all that silly legal mumbo-jumbo out of the way though, I've got to figure out the difference between right and wrong pretty damn quick, because I'll be damned if I go one more Christmas without finally getting that Talkboy tape recorder. And since this goofy-looking ankle bracelet I got on my leg won't let me go observe people in real life, I'm gonna have to develop my moral compass by taking a look at the characters from my all-time favorite game, Persona 5 Royal. If you've seen any of my videos before, then you probably already know damn well that I'm quite fond of this game right here for assloads of different reasons that I'm not gonna get into right now since I'm not reviewing the damn thing. That's actually strictly forbidden in my probation via Penal Code 69. One of the main reasons why I dig it so much is because of its diverse cast of characters that you encounter through your 100+ hour journey. Some as pure as the Dickens, and some as evil as Stan himself. Not sure why this is Stan, but I guess that guy was always kind of a dick. At any rate though, I'll try my goddamnedest to rank this cast of characters starting from the goodest, going all the way to the lessest goodest. You might think that this would be pretty cut and dry given that the game has clearly defined protagonists and antagonists, but as with any good story, sometimes good people can be capable of bad things, and bad people might not be as rotten as they appear. Or, you know, sometimes certain characters are just way worse than others. There's gonna be some spoilers on the things that the characters do throughout the story, but I'm not gonna harp on the plot points too much, although I will be covering characters that were exclusive to Royal, cause that's the version that I consider to be the true finished game. Characters and strikers are out though, cause, well, I still haven't finished it yet. I'm a busy guy, frig off. There's also plenty of minor characters that had their own names and all that, but since we don't get to know them in quite the same amount of detail as some of the other characters, I'm only gonna be judging the Phantom Thieves, the Confidants, and everybody who had their own palace, otherwise we're gonna be here all day. Yeah, I know you might think that I've got all the time in the world since I'm stuck in the house with this dingus bracelet around my ankle, but you know what? There's a time cop marathon on the Dirt Bike channel in about an hour, so let's get the ball rolling with the most noble character in Persona 5 Royal, Haru Okumura. Just like you'd expect living in the world of an Atlus game, Haru had a pretty dark and rough upbringing. Sure, she may be a zillionaire thanks to the fact that her dad owns a successful burger chain, but this leads to everybody in her life from friends, adults, classmates, and teachers using her in some way to get on the good side of her butthole father. Don't worry, we'll get to him later on. Even though her dad has everything he could ever need, he's still not satisfied and essentially tries to whore his daughter off in an arranged marriage with some buttwagon who abuses cats and pervs over the idea of having a fiancé who's still in high school. All in the name of friggin' cheeseburgers, no less.
You're prostituting your
daughter.
Phone for cheeseburgers again, aren't you? Man's gotta eat.
Joker. Despite just about nobody in this poor girl's life respecting her though, Haru still ended up being an incredibly kind and gentle person, and at no point in the story does she act malicious towards anyone who isn't an immediate threat. Most evil quality about Haru is easily her bloodlust when it comes to killing shadows, and she even enjoys watching them beg for their lives. But while that may sound scary, shadows are pretty friggin' evil for the most part, so I'd like to believe that Haru is really just passionate about making the world a better place. And if I'm wrong about that, then the last thing we're gonna need to worry about is where she landed on this list. She might be a little shy and hesitant to trust others, but I mean, hey, look at me. I was blessed with a stepdad who willingly sacrificed his life just so I could charge my GameCom, and even I could be a little bit reserved from time to time. So you know what, I'd say that Haru turned out to be a pretty excellent person, even though she could have made every excuse in the book to be a dingus like a lot of other people do. Especially in this game. Hell, she's even the only Phantom Thief who has the patience to put up with Ryuji's crap. All she wants to do is live in peace, help her friends, tend to her garden, and drink her elephant poop coffee, so in my opinion, she's clearly the purest character in Persona 5 Royal. Hifumi Togo. This girl's entire life revolves around wanting to be a professional shogi player just like her father, and she's quite good at it too, having never lost a pro match. However, after getting to know her a little bit more as a confidant, you eventually find out that her mother's been paying her opponents to lose on purpose to help her gain idol status, which her critics already sort of suspected was the case given that they deemed her to be too beautiful to be a shogi player. Which I can certainly relate to. Cheating to win shogi matches isn't very nice, but Hifumi genuinely has no idea that her mom was doing this, and she's not too happy when she finds out. But since she's too good of a person to stand up to her mom, she kinda just ignores it. After the Phantom Thieves change Mrs. Dago's heart, though, Hifumi's more than happy to play fair, even though it results in her getting squashed in her very next match. She keeps to herself a little bit more than Haru does, so she doesn't help others quite as much, but making her parents happy is very important to her, and she was willing to give Joker free shogi lessons even when he was a complete stranger to her. I mean, you meet the girl in a friggin' church, so if you need to know more than that to know why she's a good person, then I'm telling Jesus on you. Yusuke Kitagawa. Yusuke's another character who had a pretty rough upbringing. His mom died when he was young, and Matarame, the man responsible for her death, took credit for all of Yusuke's artwork throughout his whole life, all while having him believe that it was fair for being provided with a place to live. Yusuke doesn't regret changing the guy's heart and making him face justice, but he's still not the vengeful type since his Stockholm Syndrome leads to him feeling sorry for the guy and making excuses for him. Despite being raised and sheltered his whole life by a sociopath, though, Yusuke turned out to be quite the gentleman, and he's actually one of the kinder Phantom Thieves. He's got more patience with Futaba's slow pace opening up than probably anyone else in the group, and he even donates blood as a friggin' hobby.
You ain't gonna catch me sharing any of my blood.
He did make An feel extremely uncomfortable trying to get her to pose nude for a painting, but she did tell him she was up for it, and it's not like he was doing it so he could look at her cans and wax his carrot to the painting later on or anything like that. Overall, I can't recall one malicious or selfish thing that Yusuke does throughout all of Persona 5 Royal, so good for him. On to Kamiki. You'd think that a teen model who's still in high school would be a bit more on the snooty side, but somehow, someway, An's actually a pretty sweet girl. In fact, early on in the game, she actually does a pretty good job at making sure the Phantom Thieves don't lose sight of the bigger picture and get carried away with the power to change people's hearts. She's not above cussing people out if she thinks they're being buttholes, which is kinda rude, but she generally gets along with pretty much anybody, and she even treats Joker like a normal person when there were rumors about him being a dangerous criminal.
Take it from me, I know how hard it can be treated like a criminal even when you're completely innocent.
On the surface, it might seem like An has no evil qualities whatsoever, but even though she did spare Kamoshida's life after he was diddling her best friend Shiho to the point where she tried to kill herself, the only reason why An spared Kamoshida is because she believed that him regretting his actions for the rest of his life after a change of heart would be a fate worse than death. And yeah, Kamoshida absolutely deserves it, but it is still vengeful on An's part to want to cause suffering on another human being who genuinely regrets his actions. Understandably vengeful, but still vengeful nonetheless, which is why I didn't put her at the tippity top. Makoto Nijima. Makoto's a bit of a teacher's pet with a lot on her plate. Her dad's about as alive as my step pepper, except instead of making the ultimate sacrifice to charge an obsolete game console that nobody ever liked in the first place, hers actually died with a little bit of class in the line of duty.
Duty. Where do they come up with this stuff?
Despite all the pressure to do well in school, though, Makoto held things together pretty well and became the student council president with some pretty kick-ass grades. Sadly, though, since she didn't do anything to stop Kamoshida's abuse, most of the school thinks she's a total ass river who turned a blind eye for a letter of recommendation. But it's not like she wasn't totally pissed at all of Kamoshida's shenanigans, she just didn't think there was anything she could do to stop him, and she definitely lost a lot of sleep over it. Makoto's kind of a pushover thanks to everyone using her as a tool and her sister giving her some pretty big shoes to fill, but ultimately, it seems like she just wants to help people, and she's got a pretty strong sense of justice. It was a little bit of a toss-up for me on who's more good between An and Makoto, but the thing that dipped Makoto and ass hair more on the evil side, though, is that she did resort to blackmailing the Phantom Thieves after discovering their identity, and she also stole data from her sister's computer when Futaba asked her to. Both of those things may have been for the greater good, but we did need a tiebreaker this high up in the rankings. However, even though she does some less than noble things from time to time, they do always seem to be with good intentions and never for personal gain or with malicious intent. Sojuro Sakura. Sojuro comes off as a pretty big dick at first, but even so, he still lets Joker stay in the attic of his cafe for free despite the fact that he has a criminal record, and even let him keep a stray cat after finding out that Joker snuck one in without his knowledge, and that's pretty damn nice if you ask me. He also raises Futaba with no expectations for anything in return. Everybody in the area seems to think he's a pretty swell guy, and even risks everything by helping the Phantom Thieves directly after learning their identity by closing his shop on a whim just so they can dilly-dally all day. Hell, even just hanging out with Sojuro makes you a kinder person. His only real flaw is that he's a bit of a womanizer, but even so, he's still not the type who'd force himself on anybody or anything like that. I know that's kind of a low bar, but when you hear about how much diddling goes on in Persona 5 later on in the video, you'll appreciate Sojuro a little bit more. But even though Sojuro doesn't do any diddling himself, it is pretty scummy that he's willing to cover for Joker if he cheats on all 10 of his girlfriends, especially when one of them's his adopted daughter. But I mean, if you show up to scold your boyfriend for ditching you on Valentine's Day and can't figure out he's cheating on you when there's more than one other girl there doing the exact same thing, let alone 9 of them, then it's kinda on you if you can't figure out what's going on for yourself. Sumire Yoshizawa. This character is a bit of a can of worms, and to be honest, I've got no idea where to begin. Her sweetness in the beginning of the game rivals even that of Haru. She always says the nicest things every time she speaks, and she's never anything less than cheerful and optimistic. But whenever something's too good to be true, it usually is, and I'm not gonna do a deep dive on the details here, not necessarily to avoid spoilers.
You had your warning.
But rather because there's just way too much to get into here. Basically, her older sister Kasumi died trying to protect her, and now Sumire is taking her identity with the help of Dr. Maruki as a means to cope with the survivor's guilt. More than anything, Sumire is just a really depressed girl who has trouble coming to grips with losing her sister, and since she never really does anything evil throughout the game outside of helping Maruki for a little bit while under his influence, I can't consider her to be anything but one of the good guys. But still though, she did help one of the villains in the game for selfish reasons. Morgana. He usually prioritizes the mission over personal agendas, and he's quite chivalrous when it comes to the ladies. The problem with that, though, is that he's extra simpy to An, who he refers to as Lady An, but the only reason he's nice to her is because he wants to boink her, even though he's got the body of a cat. Like, what the hell would he even do if An were sick enough to be up for it? How far did this sicko think this through? Hell, he even tries peeking at her body without her consent at one point, which is far from noble if you ask me.
You looking at my gut?
No.
Yes, you were.
Well, I just took a little peek.
I saw you.
Morgana's somewhat easily agitated, especially when it comes to Ryuji being reckless, and he particularly doesn't like it when people call him a cat, but like, if I were a cat who had no memories, I'd be pretty salty too. Overall, he's reliable, trustworthy, and just wants to make the world a better place, and even if he can't find out who he is in the process, it's all still worth it to him, so he's not selfish. He's just kinda weird when it comes to An is all. Tauranosuke Yoshida. This guy's a politician who was accused of embezzling party funds, which earned him the nickname No Good Tora. But in the end, it actually turns out that his partner was the one embezzling the money and placed the blame on Tora. He did make a lot of mistakes himself, but he does at least realize them and truly does want what's best for the country. He never tries taking advantage of a teenager when Joker decides to lend a helping hand, even during a time where everyone hated the guy and he needed all the help he could get. He may have taken personal vacation time when he was supposed to be at a legislative meeting and even called a voter an idiot in an open forum, but if that's the worst thing a politician's guilty of, then I'd say that makes Tauranosuke a saint. Chihaya Mifune. Chihaya's bubbly and cheerful attitude's got good written all over it, and, well, for the most part, she is pretty sweet. However, when you first meet this fortune teller, she scams you into buying these psychic gimmick stones for 100,000 yen, only for them to turn out to be plain old rocks like the one my neighbor Terry makes in his cellar. She'd be a lot closer to the naughty portion of the video if she were acting on her own. However, it turns out she's only scamming people because her shady employers are forcing her to do so, and according to her own fortunes, there's no way she could ever escape them. And she might have been lying about those overpriced gimmicks she was selling, but her ability to tell fortunes is the real deal, so I can't blame her for accepting her own fate here. After Joker and the gang intervene, though, she realizes that while her predictions may be accurate, they're not absolute and can in fact be changed with enough effort.
I knew I should have listened to that guy who told me my stepdad would die if I unplugged that machine, but how was I supposed to know he was a legitimate fortune teller when he was disguised as a friggin' doctor?
Not too long after learning fate could be altered, though, Chihaya knocked it off with the tomfoolery and pretty much decided to try and help people for a living. She may not give fortunes away for free, but she's got bills to pay too, you know, and considering that you can't find her services anywhere else, her prices are actually pretty reasonable. Much like most of the adult female confidants in this video, though, she proves to be more than willing to diddle Joker, who is still a minor, so, you know, she kinda loses some points there. Other than that, though, she's a pretty good person. Eugene Sakamoto. Most people probably think of Ryuji as a bit of a bad boy, what with him always getting in trouble and being a ruffian. But even though he's definitely got an anger problem, the thing that pisses him off the most are scumbags who hurt and take advantage of others. While he may have a short fuse, he never draws first blood when it comes to fighting, and he's even nice enough to censor his F-bombs just in case any kids are around, which is pretty noble of him to do in an M-rated game where he could say anything he wants. As much of a heart of gold as Ryuji may have deep down, though, he was totally up for hiring a sex maid with Joker and Mishima. To be fair, he did end up backing out of it in the end, but had he been alone with the maid, I tend to think he'd ended up sprucing her, because he was still perverted enough to stare at An's cons while inside the Morgana mobile. He did at least admit to staring, so I guess it's better to be an honest pervert, but still though, Ryuji can be a bit of a perv nonetheless. Although I suppose he could say the same thing about pretty much anyone these days.
Hell, even my friggin' dentist is a weirdo these days. Just the other day, I went in for a basic cleaning and he tried to take my temperature rectally, and I didn't really make a big deal about it even though he was taking forever, but when he put both of his hands on my shoulders, I knew it was time to find a new dentist.
So I guess if staring at An's bosom's the worst thing he's ever done, then I suppose I could give Ryuji a little bit of wiggle room. Futaba Sakura. Futaba's an overall good person, even if she is extremely shy and reserved due to her sheltered upbringing, but while most of her world-class hacking may be for the greater good, she does sometimes hack for the fun of it. You know what, these security breaches could potentially lead to people losing their jobs, although I suppose you could argue that they deserve to lose their jobs since they did kind of fail at them. But even so, reckless hacking could lead to businesses losing money in general, which would cause regular employees to lose their jobs too. Since we never actually see this happen in the game, though, I guess I won't hold it against Futaba, but it is something I hope she's thinking about.
And the same goes to all you would-be hackers out there who try to get my credit card info off of biggins.gov.
But not only does Futaba's hacking run the risk of families losing their main source of income, but any kind of hacking in general is a pretty big risk for poor old Sojuro, since he'd be the one taking all the heat given that Futaba's a minor. And for a guy who does so damn much for this girl, including buying these computers for her in the first place, it's really not fair for him to potentially face prison time just because Futaba felt like breaking countless laws out of boredom. Whether it be Futaba hacking in the real world or in the metaverse, her work for the Phantom Thieves does help a lot of people, but while helping people does make her happy, her motives for being in the gang to begin with are possibly the most selfish out of anyone in the group, and that she's really just looking for information on her mother's death as well as revenge more so than justice. I wouldn't call Futaba a bad person. In fact, she's definitely a good one, just not the best is all. Shinya Oda. Much like 90% of the internet, this boy's pretty arrogant about how good he is at a game that's most likely going to be outdated and irrelevant in a few years. He does help Joker get better at said game, but he's pretty harsh and foul-mouthed in his lessons and only agrees to teach him for personal gain. You know, at the end of the day, he is still a kid who hasn't fully committed into who he's going to be for the rest of his life, so I can't be too hard on him. And after all, we can't all expect him to be the MVP of the T-ball team at such a young age, so we really shouldn't be too hard on him for being a little bit of a dingus and just help him solve his mommy issues so he could grow up to be a successful proctologist or something like that. Yuki Mishima. After being powerless to stop Kamoshida like a lot of other students, he tries to redeem himself by helping the Phantom Thieves by running their website and giving them reasonable requests that people make for potential part changes. He mainly does this to make the world a better place, but there is a big part of him that gets carried away with knowing famous people, and he kinda acts a little bit smug about it for a little bit. Luckily, the Phantom Thieves brought him back down to earth, but another thing working against his good boy ranking is that he was there when Joker and Ryuji requested a maid service, so he's definitely far from perfect. Still though, he's a pretty good dude for the most part, I suppose. Ichiko Oya. This right here is a journalist who's got no issues with running clickbait headlines and not doing her due diligence if it means the story's gonna sell. However, the reason why she became such a jabroni in the first place is because she exposed a scandal involving a cohort of one of the game's main villains. Not only did this lead to her being reassigned to entertainment, but it also led to her partner disappearing, so it's understandable that she'd lose her passion and turn to the dark side a little bit. She's manipulative, cynical, pretends to get drunk off of water for some reason, and much like most of the other adult female confidants in this game, she too's down to diddle Joker, even though he's still in high school. Before the diddling commences though, simply being around Joker helps her realize that her partner's still alive, and she decides to get back to reporting with integrity. She's got some bad flaws, but overall, she's not really malicious most of the time, even if she is a bit sassy every now and then. Sadayo Kawakami. Joker's homeroom teacher genuinely cares about her students. In fact, she cares about them so much that she even becomes a maid prostitute, even though the game won't straight up say that's what she is. I do feel bad that she's got to do this to pay foster parents who are blaming her for the death of their kid when she really wasn't responsible at all, but, I mean, that doesn't make it okay that she's open to dating a high schooler. Never mind the fact that Joker's a minor, but he's also one of Kawakami's students, so the power dynamic adds an extra layer of taboo that the other adult female confidants don't have. Munehisa Iwai. The textbook definition of a badass with a heart of gold, Iwai's involved in a lot of shady business just to take care of his son, which I can certainly respect, but that still doesn't make it right for him to get a high schooler to do some of his dirty work. To be fair, most of the time Iwai's odd jobs involve doing some pretty simple stuff, but they do occasionally lead to Joker finding himself in danger, and even though he did volunteer, any responsible adult wouldn't have even given him the option to in the first place. Tai Takemi. This punk rock doc forces an underage high schooler to take experimental and potentially dangerous drugs in exchange for enabling him to buy normal drugs from her, which is actually pretty punk to do. Joker only wants these drugs for the effects they have in the metaverse, but since the doctor's got no idea what the metaverse is, the only reason she could have possibly come up with as to why a teenager would want drugs is that he wants to get high, which is pretty damn bad of her to enable. I mean, she even calls Joker a guinea pig and ends up diddling him. Of course, my description of her actions leave a lot of details out. She obviously has reasons for doing what she does. She's testing drugs on Joker to perfect a medicine that'll save the life of a child, even though she already thinks the child's dead, and the reason why she's diddling him is because, well, she's horny. Yeah, I didn't say she had good reasons for doing what she does, but all I know is that Dr. Takemi's honest intentions are to help people, so even if she goes about it in a way that's dangerous to others, I guess I'll count her as a good person aside from the diddling. But if you think about it, I guess the in-game adults diddling Joker's kinda like diddling the adult player, since the words we choose for them to hear are ultimately where the seduction comes from. And even though Joker's body's that of a teenager, there are people in real life who have the bodies of children despite being full-grown adults. So I guess you could say that in-game adults dating Joker's kinda the same thing as a real-life adult dating Hasbulla. Unless, of course, a child ends up playing the game in the real world, in which case these women are friggin' sick.
Man, I know kids shouldn't be playing this game since the box has an M rating on it, but I mean, even if a minor has a fake ID, that's no excuse. So you know what? I'm calling the cops on all these freaking diddlers. Hello? Is this 1-800-POLICE? I've got 3 adult females who are diddling a 17-year-old high school boy.
Nice.
Oh well, I tried.
Anyway, let's move more into the neutral category, starting with Igor. Since he helps the protagonist out and is pretty cool, I'd consider him to be a little bit more on the good side if he put a gun up my ass and made me choose. He doesn't help quite as much as he'd like to have since he was out of commish for most of the game, but once he's back, he does everything that he can, and that's really all he could ask out of anybody. Justine. Her only real goal is to help Joker in his rehabilitation, and she goes about it in a pretty calm and reasonable manner. She does speak to him in a bit of a condescending tone, but she's never really rude, but while she is helpful, she's ultimately just following orders and doing her job. Caroline. She's got the exact same job as Justine, but Caroline's always a bitch about it, so I put her a little bit lower. And no, I didn't forget about Lavenza since I thought it'd be more fun to rank the twins separately, but if you really gotta know, then I guess put her in between. Sae Nijama. This one's pretty tough. On one hand, Sae rigs prosecutions to maintain the court's reputation, even if the people indicted by her are innocent, and she's also completely obsessed with bringing the Phantom Thieves down for half the game, despite all the good they do for society. But on the other hand, she did believe that the Phantom Thieves were responsible for all the mental shutdowns that have been killing people, so I guess she does have a job to do. Once she eventually learns the truth about all the wacky things that have been going on, though, she's more than happy to lend a helping hand and ultimately ends up saving the day. Like I mentioned earlier, Sae pretty much has to raise her sister Makoto all by herself after the death of her father, but even though Makoto turned out to be a pretty good person in her own right, Sae can still be pretty friggin' mean to her from time to time, like telling her she's a burden straight to her face. But she did feel bad about that immediately after, and she really does have a lot on her plate, so it's kinda hard to decide whether or not Sae is more on the good or evil side. I guess it depends on how far in the game you are, but ultimately Sae was capable of doing some pretty bad things, so even though she redeemed herself in a big way by the end of the game, I'd still say she's got a little bit more redeeming left to do. But to her credit, she is the only female adult confidant in the game who won't diddle Joker, so I will give her some brownie points for that. Jose. Despite this boy's appearance, he's actually not a human, but he wants to understand humans by collecting flowers throughout mementos and turning them into juice. I have no idea how flower juice would help one understand humans, but then again, I've never tried it before, so maybe that's why I still don't see the problem with pulling the plug on my stepdad to save energy, partially to charge my Gamecom, but mainly for the sake of the environment since I'm such a good person. Ultimately, Jose's just a businessman looking to trade flowers and stamps for items and cognition changes to mementos itself, which does help the Phantom Thieves, but Jose's purely doing this for personal gain, so you can't really say that it makes him a good person, although it doesn't necessarily make him bad either, which is why I think he's the epitome of neutral. Although he is pretty polite, so I guess you could consider him to be slightly good, but I can only imagine what kinds of crimes he'd be capable of committing if he were to just have that one bad day.
Probably tax fraud.
Joker. Okay, so I know that Joker's actions entirely depend on the player's choices, but, like, he won't tell you no to doing any of these awful things, and if he's capable of doing them under the right circumstances, then I think that ought to vouch for his personal integrity. So what kind of mischief's Joker capable of getting into? Well, cheating on 10 different women at the same time, snitching on his friends, being a dick, and betraying all of humanity, just to name a few. The possibilities of how big of a dick you can make him into are endless, given how many choices the game gives you. I'm sure the Joker on most people's save files is probably a pretty decent guy, and he definitely is in the anime and manga, but when left to his own devices in the game, he could definitely have some pretty evil thoughts, even if they aren't the worst in the entire story. Then again, Joker did prevent a diddling, which is why this game even exists in the first place, but he is still capable of a lot of malarkey. Takuto Maruki. This school counselor is probably one of the least evil villains in video game history. In fact, some probably wouldn't even consider him a villain at all. His goal is to pretty much turn the world into a magical dreamland where everyone's living the perfect life, kinda like the Matrix, except everybody's happy.
Yeah, when we take our road trip to Fantasyland.
In fact, he even gets his delusional world up and running for a little bit, giving everyone a free sample. In this world, Futaba's mom's alive, An's friend Shiho's perfectly healthy, along with some other wacky things like Morgana finally being able to live as a human. I can understand why some people would want this, but the guy's trying to force this false reality onto everybody just because he can't deal with the pain of his girlfriend's death. The only reason he gives the Phantom Thieves a choice in the matter in the first place is because he wasn't able to force them to, but he sure as frig did try, and I think that's pretty rude. Life sucks, sure, but part of it's overcoming trauma, and like everybody always getting what they wanted, it inevitably contradict things for each other. I mean, what if like 30 people had the same dream of being MVP of their t-ball team? Like that ever happened? Dr. Maruki was a pretty nice guy throughout the whole game, but in the end, he was still willing to murder a bunch of teenagers just so he could force a false reality onto the entire world, and if you ask me, that kinda makes him a weenie. Kunikazu Okumura. Alright, now we're getting to the dastardly villains of the game, the total scum of the earth, starting with Haru's father, oddly enough. Like I mentioned earlier, this butt dumpling's got no problem with forcing his daughter to marry a guy who he knows damn well is gonna treat her bad just to gain some political power and money to buy more cheeseburgers. It's eventually revealed that he did actually care for his daughter at one point in time, even if he did inevitably end up prioritizing money and power over her, and while he never actually kills anybody himself, he still works his employees damn near to death, viewing them as disposable tools, and in my book, that's more than enough to qualify this man as evil. Goro Akechi. Alright, now we're getting into murderer territory, so make sure you're ready. It's easy to feel bad for Akechi since he was born from one of the game's main villains, person a prostitute, and as if that wasn't enough of a recipe for disaster, his mom went on to kill herself while Akechi was still a wee lad. So needless to say, he lived a pretty rough life and eventually wanted to kill his father by getting close with him first. Just because someone had a bad life doesn't mean you should make excuses for him being a turd, because trust me, I know what it's like to go through hard times growing up. Man, let's not forget that I never ended up getting that Talkboy tape recorder for Christmas, so if anyone's got an excuse to commit first-degree manslaughter on their father, then it's certainly me, but I only stooped to third degree, and it wasn't even my real father, just my stepfather.
Allegedly.
And it'd be one thing if he only wanted to kill his evil dad and call it a day, but since the guy was pretty high up in the government, Akechi had to do a lot of dirty work to earn his trust that mostly consisted of murder, which he had no problem going through with. Hell, he even killed Futaba's mom and Haru's dad, and it's for things like this why I hate that I'm supposed to pretend to like the guy in Persona Q2. But to be fair, he is one of the few people on this list who never resorted to diddling, so whoopee. Speaking of diddling though, Suguru Kamashita. This guy's a friggin' creep. He blackmails high school girls into letting him diddle them, and even tried to do the same thing to An, who, as we determined earlier, was a pretty good person. I swear, this guy did so much diddling that I'm starting to get tired of using the term diddling.
Trust me, I know the term's getting old, but what do you want? This game's got a lot of diddling in it.
On top of all of Kamoshida's sexual misconduct, though, he's also highly abusive to the students on the volleyball team, which I think is way worse than Okumura, because at least overworking your employees leads to big money and more cheeseburgers, but like, who gives a shit if your high school team wins a volleyball trophy? We're all just gonna forget. Kamoshida never directly killed anybody, but his abuse led to An's best friend Shio jumping off of the school building, and he didn't have any remorse over it whatsoever. I'd imagine that under the right circumstances, he probably wouldn't have any issues killing somebody if he absolutely had to. Ichirusai Matarame. This here's another one of those bad guys who's nice on the surface and seems to be liked by most people, but in reality, he not only let Yusuke's mom die, but he also stole credit for her life's work, the Sayuri. Like, I could totally understand letting someone die to catch a charge, but come on, man, a painting? Really?
Get a life, you loser!
He also raised Yusuke while taking credit for everything he's ever done, and like I said before, he even convinced the poor guy to be grateful for it. Kamoshida may have hurt more people, but I think what Matarame did to Yusuke and his mom's a smidge worse. Although, depending on what day you ask me, I can see myself switching these two back and forth. Masayoshi Shido. This guy's pretty much the main villain of the game outside of Yaldabaoth, who I won't be ranking because, well, it's a friggin' demon, of course it's evil. Bushido, on the other hand, though, has committed pretty much every sin you could imagine. He's unnecessarily cruel, he diddles women, frames Joker for a crime just because he tried to prevent a diddling, he assassinates people, has at least one illegitimate kid as a result of diddling who he ended up abandoning, had Futaba's mom killed by that illegitimate kid and convinced her family that it was Futaba's fault, tries killing his illegitimate kid, and that's just scratching the surface. Unlike some of the other bad people in this game, there's really no way you could justify Shido's actions, but as evil as he may be, I still think there's one man who's a tad bit worse. Junya Kaneshiro. This guy's reign of terror may not have affected nearly as many people or done as much damage as Shido's did, but I still think that his heart and soul are a little bit worse. See, a lot of what Shido did outside of diddling's usually a part of some kind of a plan to move up in the world, but Kaneshiro, on the other hand, doesn't really care about any of that. I mean, he definitely wants more money and power, but not because he has some kind of a goal that requires it. He's just greedy for the sake of being greedy. And to get more money, he resorts to manipulating teenagers and only teenagers into thinking they're working a somewhat legitimate job for like a minute, only to blackmail them into doing illegal activities once he has dirt on them. And should the teens get in trouble with the law, they're the only ones taking all the heat, while Kaneshiro and his gang yuck it up all the way to the bank. And I mean, just look at this guy. He doesn't even look like he's trying not to look like a sleazeball. He's just like, yeah, I know I look like the guy who stole Pee Wee Herman's bike, so what? I'm a scumbag, deal with it. He mostly has his teenage pawns trafficking drugs, but when he tries blackmailing Makoto with photos of her with drugs and alcohol, he plans on forcing her to sell her body if the gang can't pay him an impossibly high fee every month. And according to his shadow in the metaverse, his plans to eventually use Makoto to force her sister Saya to do the same thing as well, just for trying to meddle in his affairs, what with her being a prosecutor. I don't remember the game ever showing any examples of this, but I'd imagine that the guy's probably trafficked teenagers before since he seems pretty comfortable with the methods he uses on Makoto. And if you ask me, I think human trafficking is literally the worst thing humans are capable of. And as far as I know, that's one low that I don't think Shido ever stooped to, at least not directly anyway. I'm sure he's not exactly against it or anything like that, but just imagine how much worse Kanashiro's reign of terror would be if he had as much power as Shida. What really drives home how evil Kanashiro really is to me is the cutscene that plays when he failed to change his heart by the deadline, where the cops tell Joker that Makoto was a drugged-up slave working for the guy. I don't know about you, but that makes me feel way more awful than anything any other character in the game ever does.
But there you have it, the 30 most prominent Persona 5 Royal characters, judged by a guy like me who's got no business lecturing anybody on what's right or wrong, since I still don't really get what the big deal is about me unplugging my stepdad's hemodialysis machine. Like, maybe it's because the Gamecom only takes batteries, so my stepdad died in vain? But since Persona 5 Royal's got like 80 billion potential lines of dialogue depending on all the different choices you can make though, there is a good chance that there's a sentence or two that might change my mind on some of these rankings. So if you disagree with me on any of them, then be completely rude about it in the comments. No civil debate or anything like that, just be completely unreasonable in your stance, so maybe, just maybe, you'll take my spot in the evil rankings IRL. Because let's be real, if I were to die right now, then I'm probably going to hell for what I may or may not have done to my stepdad. And I suppose hell wouldn't be all that bad, since I do hear they have a Sega Genesis down there, but my stepdad's been known to hold petty grudges, so I'd rather not spend all eternity in a place where I'll eventually run into him. So go ahead and be as mean to me as you want in the comments, but if you'll excuse me, I gotta go to confession so I can get away with all my sins scot-free. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been 69 days since my last confession, and I kinda sorta pulled the plug on my stepdad to charge an obsolete game console, and to make matters worse, I found out later that it's battery powered. Well, my child, was your stepdad a dick? Well, yeah, he kinda was, actually. Well, then it would appear you've done nothing wrong, my son. Yeah! Yeah, now show me your butt, boy. Wait, what? No!
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.